I guess it's true what they say sometimes, the worst pain comes from the people you never expected to hurt you. I'm Joe, a 42-year-old guy who thought he had everything figured out. I've been married to Sarah for almost 15 years, and we've got 2 kids, Sophie and Jake, who are 12 and 10. Our life wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but it was good. Or at least, I thought it was. Sarah and I met in college, back when things were simple. She was this fiery, independent woman who seemed to know exactly what she wanted out of life. I was drawn to her confidence, the way she never backed down from a challenge. We got married a couple of years after graduation, and I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. We bought a house in the suburbs, had our kids, and settled into what I thought was a comfortable routine. But lately, things had started to feel off. Sarah had become distant, spending more time on her phone and less time talking to me. Our conversations, once filled with shared dreams and plans for the future, had dwindled down to the bare minimum: who was picking up the kids, what needed to be done around the house, and the usual small talk that didn't really mean anything. I told myself it was just a phase, that maybe we were both just tired from the daily grind of work and parenting. I tried to brush off the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I mean, we'd been together for so long, right? We'd been through ups and downs before, and we always came out stronger. But this time, it felt different. There was an edge to Sarah's voice that hadn't been there before, a coldness in her eyes when she looked at me. And our sex life? Well, that had pretty much vanished over the past few months. She always had some excuse: too tired, too stressed, not in the mood. I didn't push it, thinking she just needed some space. It wasn't just the lack of intimacy, though. It was the little things that started to add up. Like the way she would suddenly stop smiling when I walked into the room, or the way she would quickly put her phone down when I sat next to her. She started going out more, 2 girls' nights with friends I barely knew, and weekend trips to visit her sister. At first, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her, and I didn't want to be the kind of husband who questioned every little thing. But the more it happened, the more that uneasy feeling in my gut grew. I remember one night in particular when I started to really suspect something was wrong. Sarah had gone out with some friends, and I was home with the kids. After they were asleep, I sat in the living room, trying to watch TV, but my mind kept drifting to where she was and what she was doing. She came home late, well past midnight, smelling like a mix of perfume and cigarette smoke, 2 things that had never been part of her usual scent. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off, saying they'd been at a bar and someone must have been smoking nearby. It didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. But then there was the underwear. I found it by accident one morning while I was doing the laundry. A lacy, red pair of panties that I'd never seen before, tucked away at the bottom of the hamper. They weren't the kind of thing Sarah usually wore, not for a long time, anyway. My heart sank, but I convinced myself that maybe she'd bought them for me and was planning some kind of surprise. How stupid I was to even think that. As the weeks went on, Sarah's behavior only got stranger. She became more secretive, more guarded. I'd catch her texting someone late at night, her face lighting up in a way it hadn't when she looked at me for months. When I asked her who she was talking to, she would snap at me, saying it was just a friend from work, or that it was none of my business. Every time she said that, it felt like a slap to the face, but I didn't want to start a fight in front of the kids. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. I had to find out what was really going on. And that's where everything started to unravel. It all came crashing down one Saturday afternoon. Sarah had told me she was heading out to run some errands, nothing unusual, just a trip to the grocery store and maybe a stop at the mall. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but that day, something felt different. Maybe it was the way she avoided eye contact when she kissed me goodbye, or the fact that she seemed unusually anxious as she grabbed her keys and left. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to follow her. I know how that sounds: crazy, paranoid, obsessive, but at that moment, I didn't care. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. So, I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. I drove a couple of blocks behind her, keeping enough distance that she wouldn't notice me tailing her. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing the fear and suspicion that had been growing inside me for weeks. Sarah didn't go to the grocery store. Instead, she drove to a part of town we didn't usually visit, pulling into a small, nondescript parking lot next to an old strip mall. There was nothing special about the place, just a few rundown shops and a couple of restaurants that had seen better days. I parked a distance away, watching as she got out of the car and walked toward a coffee shop at the end of the strip. I recognized the place, she'd mentioned it a few times before, saying she liked to go there to clear her head. But she wasn't alone. As she approached the entrance, a man stepped out from the coffee shop. He was tall, with dark hair and a confident, almost cocky way of carrying himself. I didn't recognize him at first, but as they got closer, I realized it was Paul, a guy she used to work with. He'd been a friend of ours for years, someone we'd had over for dinner a few times. I never thought much of it, never saw him as a threat, but now, seeing them together, something clicked. They weren't just friends. There was something about the way she looked at him, the way her face lit up when she saw him, that told me everything I needed to know. My stomach turned as I watched them exchange a few words, laughing and joking like they didn't have a care in the world. Then, without warning, they moved closer, and before I could fully process what was happening, they kissed. It wasn't just a peck on the cheek or a quick, friendly kiss. This was passionate, full of heat and longing, the kind of kiss we hadn't shared in months. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white as I tried to control the wave of emotions crashing over me. Anger, betrayal, sadness, they all hit me at once, like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but at the same time, I couldn't look away. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture. I don't know why I did it, maybe some part of me wanted proof, something tangible to show that this nightmare was real. My hands were shaking so badly that the first few pictures came out blurry, but I managed to get a clear shot just as they pulled apart, Sarah looking up at him with a smile that I hadn't seen in months. It made me sick to my stomach. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching them as they walked into the coffee shop together, hand in hand. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. This was the woman I'd spent the last 15 years with, the mother of my children, the person I thought I'd grow old with. How could she do this? How could she throw away everything we'd built together for a fling with some asshole who wasn't even a part of our lives anymore? Eventually, I snapped out of it. I couldn't sit there all day, stewing in my own rage and confusion. I had to confront her, to make her explain what the hell was going on. But I knew I couldn't just barge into the coffee shop and cause a scene. I needed to think this through, to be smart about it. If I went in guns blazing, I'd give her the chance to twist things around, to make me look like the crazy one. No, I needed to stay calm, to collect my thoughts and approach this with a clear head. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the scene over and over again. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I felt like I was going to explode. I didn't want the kids to see me like this, so I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to calm myself down. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of them kissing, the way she looked at him like he was the only person in the world that mattered. When I finally walked into the house, the kids were in the living room, engrossed in some cartoon on TV. They barely noticed me come in, too wrapped up in their own little world. I didn't have the heart to tell them what was going on, to shatter their image of the happy family we used to be. So, I forced a smile and asked them how their day was, pretending like everything was fine. But inside, I was dying. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, every tick of the clock a reminder that my life was falling apart. I couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on anything. All I could think about was Sarah, out there with him, doing God knows what while I sat at home, waiting like a fool. She finally came home a couple of hours later, acting like nothing was wrong. She walked in with a couple of shopping bags, smiling at the kids and chatting with them about their day. When she saw me, her smile faltered for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. But she quickly recovered, plastering on that fake grin that I'd come to despise. "Hey, hon," she said, walking over to me and giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "How was your day?" I could barely look at her. My blood was boiling, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. But I forced myself to stay calm, to play along for now. "It was fine," I said, my voice tight. "How about you?" "Oh, same old," she replied, her voice light and casual. Just ran some errands, did a little shopping. Nothing too exciting. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She was lying through her teeth, and it took everything in me not to confront her right then and there. But I knew I had to wait, to find the right moment to bring it up. I needed to keep my cool, to gather more information before I made my move. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let her get away with this. The hours that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I paced around the house, trying to keep my mind from spiraling out of control. The kids were oblivious, laughing at their shows and playing in the living room, completely unaware that their family was on the brink of falling apart. I wanted to tell them everything, but I knew that I needed to talk to Sarah first. She owed me that much: an explanation, a confession, something to make sense of this nightmare. Sarah busied herself with dinner, humming softly to herself as if she hadn't just been caught kissing another man. The sight of her acting so normal, so content, made my blood boil. How could she be so calm, so carefree, after what she'd done? I kept replaying the image of them together in my mind, each time feeling the sting of betrayal more acutely. I knew I couldn't let this drag on. I couldn't pretend everything was okay, not when my marriage was hanging by a thread. So, after we put the kids to bed, I decided it was time. I found her in the kitchen, cleaning up the dishes. The smell of the dinner she'd cooked, a roast chicken with all the trimmings, made me sick to my stomach. It was one of my favorites, and I wondered if she had done that on purpose, trying to ease her guilt by playing the dutiful wife. "Sarah," I said, my voice low and strained. She turned to look at me, her hands still wet from the dishwater. "What is it, Joe?" she asked, her tone casual, almost dismissive. "We need to talk." Something in my voice must have tipped her off, because her expression changed instantly. She put down the dish she was holding and turned to face me fully, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "About what?" "About what you did today." I saw the flash of panic in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She tried to play it off, shrugging her shoulders like it was no big deal. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Sarah," I snapped, my voice rising. "I know you weren't just out running errands. I saw you with him." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she was speechless. Then, as if flipping a switch, her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture that I had come to recognize all too well. "Were you following me?" she demanded, her voice laced with anger. "Is that what this is about? You don't trust me, so you're spying on me now?" "Don't turn this around on me," I shot back, my anger boiling over. "I'm not the one sneaking around and kissing someone else in a goddamn parking lot. How long has this been going on, Sarah? How long have you been lying to me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes narrowing as if she was trying to figure out how to twist this to her advantage. Finally, she let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Joe. It's not like I'm sleeping with him. It was just a kiss." "Just a kiss?" I repeated, disbelief flooding my voice. "You've been sneaking around with him behind my back, and you have the nerve to stand there and tell me it was just a kiss? Do you even hear yourself right now?" She rolled her eyes, her expression one of utter contempt. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. Paul and he's just someone I've been talking to, someone who actually listens to me. You've been so distant, so wrapped up in your own world, you don't even notice when I'm in the room anymore. I needed someone to talk to, someone who made me feel like I mattered." "Bullshit!" I shouted, slamming my fist down on the kitchen counter. The noise echoed through the room, but I didn't care. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me. I've been here, Sarah. I've been here every damn day, trying to hold this family together while you've been off chasing some fantasy. What the hell is wrong with you?" Her eyes flashed with anger, and she took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you, Joe? You don't touch me, you don't talk to me, and when you do, it's like I'm some burden you have to deal with. I've been lonely for years, and you didn't even notice. You think being a good husband is just paying the bills and mowing the lawn? You haven't been my husband for a long time." Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see how much they hurt. Instead, I forced myself to stay focused, to push through the pain and get to the truth. So what? You decided to go find yourself another husband? Is that it? You think kissing him in some sleazy parking lot is going to fix everything? She didn't answer. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes cold and unfeeling. It was like looking at a stranger, someone I didn't even recognize. I'd always thought we could work through anything, that our marriage was strong enough to survive whatever life threw at us. But now, standing in front of her, I realized just how wrong I was. Answer me, Sarah. I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. Is that what you want? Is he what you want? She hesitated, her eyes flicking away from mine for just a moment, but it was enough. In that split second, I saw the truth, the doubt, the confusion, the guilt. But I also saw the anger, the resentment that had been building inside her for years, just waiting for the right moment to explode. I don't know, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what I want anymore. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under me, like everything I'd ever known was crumbling to dust. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd devoted my life to, didn't know if she wanted to be with me anymore. And then it hit me, this wasn't just about some kiss in a parking lot. This was about years of neglect, years of taking each other for granted, years of pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I'd been so focused on providing for my family, on making sure the bills were paid and the house was maintained, that I'd forgotten the most important thing of all, my wife, the woman I'd promised to love and cherish until death do us part. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. It didn't make her betrayal any less painful, any less real. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to find the words to express the anger and hurt that were tearing me apart. You had no right, I finally said, my voice low and dangerous. No right to do this to me, to our family. You think you've been lonely? You think I haven't noticed how distant you've become? I've felt it too, Sarah, but I didn't go running off to find someone else. I didn't betray you. She opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off, unable to hold back any longer. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any idea what this means for us, for our kids? You've destroyed everything, Sarah. Everything. She flinched at my words, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same cold, detached expression she'd been wearing since I first confronted her. Maybe it's already been destroyed, she said quietly, her voice devoid of any emotion. Maybe we've been living a lie for a long time, and we just didn't want to see it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like she'd given up, like she was willing to throw away everything we'd built together without even trying to save it. I wanted to shake her, to scream at her, to make her understand just how much she was throwing away. But I knew it wouldn't do any good. She was too far gone, too wrapped up in her own pain and resentment to see what she was doing. Is that it, then? I asked, my voice shaking with anger and despair. Are you done? Are you just going to walk away from everything we've built, everything we've been through? She didn't answer. She just looked at me with those cold, empty eyes, and I knew that I'd already lost her. Maybe I'd lost her a long time ago, and I was just too blind to see it. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, not trusting myself to stay in the same room with her any longer. I needed air, needed to get away from the suffocating tension that had filled our home. But as I walked through the house, I couldn't escape the feeling that everything was slipping through my fingers, that my life was falling apart and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I stepped outside and stood on the porch, taking deep breaths of the cool night air. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was all too much. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to make this pain go away, but I knew that nothing would change what had happened. And then, as I stood there, staring out into the darkness, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't just let her walk away from what she'd done without facing the consequences. She had betrayed me, betrayed our family, and she had to pay for that. I wasn't sure what I was going to do yet, but one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let her get away with this. The days that followed the confrontation were some of the darkest I've ever experienced. Every time I looked at Sarah, all I could see was that kiss, that smug smile she had when she thought she was getting away with it. The anger inside me simmered, turning over and over in my mind like a storm that wouldn't settle. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and every moment spent in the same house as her felt like a betrayal of myself. Sarah, for her part, acted like nothing had happened. She went about her days as if we hadn't just had the most brutal argument of our marriage. She was cordial to me, but there was a new edge to her voice, a kind of defiance that hadn't been there before. It was like she was daring me to do something, to react, to lash out. And every time I thought about how casually she'd brushed off her betrayal, that simmering anger threatened to boil over. I couldn't let her just move on like this, not after what she'd done. I needed to take control, to show her that there were consequences for her actions. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just sit back and let her walk all over me. I had to do something that would hurt her the way she'd hurt me, something that would make her realize that she couldn't treat me like this and get away with it. The idea came to me late one night, as I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling. She'd been so sure of herself, so convinced that she could live her life as if nothing had changed. I was going to show her just how wrong she was. The next morning, I got up early, before Sarah and the kids were awake. I knew exactly where she kept the things that mattered to her the most, her jewelry box, where she kept the few valuable pieces she'd inherited from her grandmother, and the expensive dresses and shoes she loved to flaunt at social gatherings. She was vain, always obsessed with her appearance, and I knew that taking away those things would hit her where it hurt. I started with the jewelry. I took the box out of her dresser drawer and carried it to the garage, where I knew she wouldn't find it. Then, I took out each piece one by one: the diamond earrings, the gold necklace, the antique brooch that had been in her family for generations. Each piece was a reminder of how much she valued herself, how little she valued me. I put them in a bag, along with a few of her most prized dresses. The red one she'd worn on our anniversary last year, the one she'd bought for that charity event we went to a few months ago, the pair of designer shoes she'd insisted on buying even though we couldn't really afford them. It was all going in the trash. I was going to make sure she understood just how little these things meant compared to what she'd done. I didn't take everything, though. I wanted her to notice that something was missing, to wonder where her most cherished possessions had gone. I wanted her to feel the way I'd felt when I caught her with him, confused, betrayed, and powerless. Once I'd gathered everything, I drove out to a secluded spot in the woods a few miles from our house. There was an old fire pit there, a place where we used to go camping before the kids were born. I hadn't been there in years, but it was perfect for what I had in mind. I dumped the bag into the pit and stood there for a moment, staring at the pile of jewelry and clothes, thinking about everything that had led up to this moment. Then, without hesitation, I pulled out a lighter and set the whole thing on fire. The flames roared to life, consuming everything in seconds. I watched as the jewelry melted, the gold and silver warping and blackening in the heat. The dresses went up in smoke, the fabric curling and turning to ash. It was strangely satisfying, watching those symbols of her vanity and pride burn to nothing. The thought of her reaction when she found out was the only thing that brought me any sense of peace. When I got back home, I acted like nothing had happened. Sarah was up by then, bustling around the kitchen, getting breakfast ready for the kids. She gave me a curt nod as I walked in, clearly still holding on to some of that defiance from our last argument. I didn't respond, just poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, pretending to be engrossed in my phone. But inside, I was waiting. Waiting for the moment when she would go to her dresser, when she would open the drawer and find her jewelry box missing, when she would realize that her precious possessions were gone. I didn't have to wait long. It happened just after breakfast. Sarah had gone upstairs to get dressed, and I heard her moving around in the bedroom, probably getting ready to put on one of her fancy outfits. Then, there was silence. I could almost picture her opening the drawer, her face going from confusion to panic in a matter of seconds. A moment later, she came storming down the stairs, her face red with anger, her eyes wild as she looked at me. "Joe," she screamed, her voice shaking. "Where is it? Where the hell is my jewelry box?" I didn't look up from my phone, keeping my voice as calm as possible. "What jewelry box?" "Don't play dumb with me," she snapped, crossing the room in a few quick strides and slamming her hands down on the table in front of me. "My jewelry box, the one that was in my dresser. It's gone, and so are my dresses. What did you do with them?" I looked up at her then, letting the anger that had been simmering inside me show in my eyes. "I got rid of them." Her mouth fell open, and for a moment, she looked like she didn't understand what I'd said. Then, the realization hit her, and she took a step back, her eyes narrowing. "You did what?" "I got rid of them," I repeated, my voice cold and unfeeling. "I took your jewelry, your dresses, and I burned them. They're gone, Sarah. Just like everything we had together." Her face twisted with rage, and she let out a scream of pure fury. "You bastard! How could you do that? Those were mine. My grandmother's jewelry. How could you?" She was close to tears now, her anger giving way to desperation. It was exactly what I'd wanted, exactly what I'd imagined when I'd set fire to her precious things. But now that I was seeing it, now that I was hearing the pain in her voice, it didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. "Why?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Why would you do that?" I stood up slowly, leaning in close so that she could see the cold rage in my eyes. "Because you deserve it. You think you can just do whatever the hell you want, that you can kiss another man and then come home and act like everything is fine? You think you can betray me and still keep all your little treasures, like nothing ever happened? No, Sarah. You don't get to have it all. You lost the right to those things the moment you decided to throw away our marriage." She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. I could see the tears welling up, but I didn't care. I wanted her to cry, to feel the pain that she'd caused me. "Do you have any idea what those things meant to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "My grandmother's jewelry, my dresses, they were all I had left." I scoffed, shaking my head in disgust. "All you had left? What about me? What about our kids? What about the life we built together? You didn't care about any of that, did you? You threw it all away for a stupid fling, and now you're crying over some jewelry? You disgust me." Her lip quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might say something else, but then she just turned and fled the room, sobbing as she ran upstairs. I heard the bedroom door slam, and then there was silence. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. The satisfaction I'd felt when I saw the flames devouring her precious things had vanished, replaced by a hollow emptiness that left me feeling more lost and broken than before. I'd wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the same pain that she'd inflicted on me. But now that I'd done it, I wasn't sure it was worth it. The image of her crying, of her begging me to tell her where her things were, kept replaying in my mind, and instead of feeling victorious, I just felt numb. I knew I couldn't stay in the house, not with the tension between us simmering just below the surface. So, I grabbed my keys and left, not even bothering to tell her where I was going. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I was going to do next. I just needed to get away, to clear my head and figure out what the hell I was going to do with my life now that everything had fallen apart. As I drove aimlessly through town, my mind kept going back to the look on Sarah's face when I told her what I'd done. I'd thought it would make me feel better, that it would give me some sense of closure or justice. But all it had done was deepen the rift between us, turning our home into a battlefield where neither of us could win. I pulled over at a park on the edge of town, one of those places we used to take the kids when they were younger. I sat on a bench, staring out at the playground, watching a couple of kids play on the swings, their laughter echoing in the air. It should have been comforting, but instead, it just made the emptiness inside me grow even larger. I didn't know how long I sat there, lost in thought, but eventually, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass. I knew I couldn't stay out forever. I had to go back, had to face the mess I created. But the thought of walking into that house, of seeing Sarah again, filled me with dread. When I finally got home, the house was dark and silent. The kids were already in bed, and Sarah was nowhere to be seen. I figured she'd locked herself in the bedroom, probably crying herself to sleep. Part of me wanted to go to her, to apologize, to try to make things right. But another part of me, the part that still held on to the anger and betrayal, refused to let me do that. So, I went to the guest room and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and numb. I didn't know what the next day would bring, didn't know how we were going to move forward from this. All I knew was that things would never be the same again. As I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. If destroying her things had only made everything worse. But it was too late to go back now. The damage was done, and there was no way to undo it. All I could do was wait and see what came next. The rage that had driven me to destroy Sarah's prized possessions didn't subside after that night. In fact, it only grew stronger. Every time I saw her in the house, every time she tried to act like nothing had happened, it reignited the fire inside me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Sarah wasn't the only one who needed to pay for what she'd done. Paul, that smug bastard who had kissed her like she was his, had to face the consequences too. I couldn't let him get away with it. He had walked into my life, into my marriage, and had the audacity to think he could take what was mine. The thought of him, of the way he looked at her, the way she looked at him, kept me awake at night, my mind churning with plans for how I could make him suffer. I didn't want to do anything rash, though. I knew I had to be smart about this, to plan it out carefully so that I could hit him where it hurt the most. The problem was, Paul wasn't just some random guy. He was someone I knew, someone who had been a part of our lives for years. I couldn't just confront him out of the blue without tipping my hand. I needed to be strategic, to catch him off guard. For days, I mulled over different ideas, trying to figure out the best way to get to him. I considered going to his workplace, causing a scene in front of his colleagues, maybe even getting him fired. But that felt too easy, too direct. I wanted something that would leave a lasting impact, something that would make him regret ever crossing me. Then it hit me: Paul had a weakness. He was proud, cocky even, and he loved to flaunt his success. He was always talking about his latest promotion, his new car, his plans to buy a bigger house. He was obsessed with his image, with making sure everyone knew just how well he was doing. And that's when I realized that the best way to hurt him was to hit him where it would hurt the most: his reputation. I started by digging up everything I could find on him. Social media was a goldmine of information: pictures of his expensive vacations, posts bragging about his accomplishments, and more importantly, a few skeletons in his closet that he probably thought were long buried. It didn't take long to find out that Paul wasn't as squeaky clean as he liked to pretend. A few unpaid parking tickets, some old credit card debt, and a couple of shady business deals that had been swept under the rug. Nothing major, but enough to cause some damage if it got into the right hands. But I needed more. I needed something that would really ruin him, something that would make him wish he'd never laid eyes on Sarah. That's when I decided to pay him a little visit, under the pretense of wanting to talk things out. It was a Friday evening when I showed up at his place. I knew he lived alone in a fancy condo downtown, the kind of place that screamed, "Look at me, I've made it." I'd been there a few times before, back when we were all still pretending to be friends. The thought of those times made me sick to my stomach, but I pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. He answered the door with a surprised look on his face, clearly not expecting me. "Joe," he said, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, forcing a calmness into my voice that I didn't feel. "Can I come in?" He hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to react, but then stepped aside and let me in. The place was exactly as I remembered it: modern, sleek, with expensive furniture and decor that screamed wealth. It made me hate him even more. We sat down in his living room, and for a few moments, there was an uncomfortable silence. Paul shifted in his seat, clearly nervous, while I took my time, letting the tension build. So, he finally said, trying to sound casual, "What's this about?" "I think you know," I replied, my voice cold and steady. He swallowed hard, his confident facade slipping. "Look, Joe, if this is about Sarah." "It is," I interrupted, leaning forward so that he could see the intensity in my eyes. "I know what you did. I know about the kiss, about how you've been seeing her behind my back." He opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off before he could get a word out. "Save it, Paul. I'm not here to listen to your excuses. I'm here to make sure you understand exactly what you've done, and what's going to happen next." He was sweating now, the fear clear in his eyes. Good. I wanted him to be afraid, to feel the same fear that I'd felt when I realized my marriage was falling apart. You thought you could just walk into my life, into my marriage, and take what's mine? I continued, my voice growing harder. You think you can play with people's lives like it's a game? Well, guess what, Paul? The game's over. What do you want, Joe? He asked, his voice shaking. I want you to feel the pain you've caused. I want you to understand that there are consequences for your actions. He looked at me, a mixture of fear and confusion on his face. Look, I'm sorry, okay? It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I held up my hand to silence him. It's too late for apologies, Paul. You made your bed, and now you're going to lie in it. I pulled out my phone and showed him the pictures I'd taken of the two of them kissing. His face went pale as he realized what I was holding in my hand. I'm going to ruin you, Paul, I said, my voice cold and merciless. I'm going to send these pictures to everyone you know, your boss, your colleagues, your family. I'm going to make sure everyone sees you for what you really are, a lying, cheating, worthless piece of shit. He started to panic, his eyes wide with fear. Joe, please, you don't have to do this. I'll do anything. Just, please, don't. I cut him off again, my voice rising in anger. Don't what, Paul? Don't expose you for the scumbag you really are? Don't let everyone see the real you? Too late. You made this mess, and now you're going to live with the consequences. He was practically begging now, his voice desperate. Please, Joe, I'm begging you. I'll stay away from Sarah, I'll leave town, whatever you want. Just don't ruin me. Please. I stared at him, the anger boiling inside me, but there was also a part of me that felt a sick satisfaction at seeing him like this, pathetic, groveling, terrified. He deserved every bit of it. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice low and menacing. You're going to disappear. You're going to quit your job, sell this condo, and leave town. You're not going to tell anyone why, you're just going to vanish. And if I ever see you near Sarah, near my family, again, I will destroy you. Do you understand? He nodded frantically, his eyes wide with fear. Yes, I understand. I'll go, I'll leave. I swear. Good, I said, standing up and putting my phone back in my pocket. You've got 1 week. If you're still here after that, I'll make sure those pictures are the least of your problems. I turned and walked to the door, not bothering to look back at him. I didn't need to. I knew he was too scared to do anything but what I told him. As I walked out of his condo and into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the kind of satisfaction I'd expected, it wasn't the triumphant feeling of victory that I'd imagined. But it was something. I had taken back some control, made him pay for what he'd done, and that was enough for now. But as I drove home, the adrenaline started to wear off, and I was left with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I had won, but at what cost? My marriage was still in shambles, my life still in pieces. And no amount of revenge was going to change that. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. I knew Sarah was probably still holed up in the bedroom, licking her wounds from the earlier confrontation. I didn't bother going upstairs. I just went to the guest room, where I'd been sleeping for the past few nights, and collapsed onto the bed. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if any of this had been worth it. I had wanted to hurt them both, to make them feel the same pain I was feeling, but all I'd done was dig myself deeper into a pit of anger and bitterness. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized that the real battle was only just beginning. The days that followed my confrontation with Paul were eerily quiet. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Sarah and I barely spoke, both of us walking on eggshells, trying to avoid another explosive argument. But I knew we couldn't keep going like this. The silence between us wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. And the longer it stretched on, the more I realized that something had to give. I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. As much as it pained me to admit it, our marriage was beyond saving. The trust had been shattered, the bond we once shared irreparably broken. Every time I looked at Sarah, all I could see was the betrayal, the lies, the coldness in her eyes when I had confronted her. There was no coming back from that. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I decided it was time to have the conversation we'd both been avoiding. I found Sarah in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in her hands, though she wasn't really reading it. She looked up when I entered the room, her expression wary, as if she knew what was coming. "Sarah," I began, my voice steady but strained. "We need to talk." She sighed and put the book down, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of resignation and exhaustion. "I know," she said quietly. "We can't keep going like this." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I hadn't wanted it to come to this, but there was no other way. We both know that things aren't going to get better. There's too much damage, too much pain. I think it's time we face the fact that our marriage is over. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. I could see the tension in her posture, the conflict in her eyes. But after a long moment, she finally nodded. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." The finality of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Even though I'd known this was coming, hearing her say it out loud made it all too real. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The reality of what we were about to do, dismantling our lives, tearing apart the family we'd built, was almost too much to bear. But I forced myself to push through the pain, to focus on what needed to be done. "We need to think about the kids," I said, my voice hoarse. "They're going to be our priority in all of this." She nodded again, her expression somber. "Of course. They're the most important thing. I think it's best if they stay with you," I continued, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. "You've always been the one who's more involved in their day-to-day lives, and they need stability right now. I'll make sure I'm still a big part of their lives, but I think it's better if they stay in the house they're used to." Sarah looked at me, her eyes softening just a bit. "Are you sure, Joe? I don't want to take them away from you." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision settle on my shoulders. "It's not about what I want," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "It's about what's best for them. And right now, that's staying with you." She nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, gratitude, maybe, or understanding. But it was quickly overshadowed by the sadness that hung between us, the sadness of two people who had once loved each other deeply, now realizing that love wasn't enough to save them. "We'll have to figure out the details," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "The custody arrangement, the house, everything." "Yeah," I agreed, feeling the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on me. "We'll work it out. We'll make sure it's fair, for the kids' sake." She nodded again, and for a moment, we just sat there in silence, both of us trying to process the enormity of what we were doing. It felt surreal, like we were outside ourselves, watching two strangers make decisions that would change their lives forever. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, Joe," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry for everything. I never meant for it to get this bad." I looked at her, seeing the pain and regret etched on her face. And despite everything, despite the anger and betrayal, I found a part of me that still cared for her, that still wanted to comfort her in her pain. "I know," I said quietly. "I'm sorry too. For my part in all of this." She wiped at her eyes, sniffling softly. "I don't want us to hate each other. I know we can't be together anymore, but I don't want it to end with us hating each other." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "I don't want that either. We've been through too much together. We owe it to ourselves, and to the kids, to end this as amicably as we can." She gave me a small, sad smile, and for a moment, it felt like we were the people we used to be, the couple who had faced the world together, side by side. But the moment passed quickly, and the reality of our situation settled back in, heavy and unyielding. "We'll tell the kids together," I said, my voice firm. "They need to hear it from both of us, and we need to be honest with them. But we'll make sure they know that we both love them, and that this isn't their fault." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. Of course. We'll do it tomorrow, after school. Okay, I agreed, feeling the weight of the upcoming conversation settle in my chest like a stone. We'll do it together. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. We didn't talk much after that, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The house felt too quiet, too empty, as if it was already mourning the loss of what we once had. That night, I slept in the guest room again, staring up at the ceiling, trying to imagine what my life was going to look like after the divorce. I couldn't picture it. All I could see was the life I had built with Sarah, the life that was now crumbling to pieces around me. The next day was one of the hardest of my life. Telling the kids about the divorce was every bit as painful as I'd imagined it would be. Sophie and Jake were devastated, their young faces contorted with confusion and hurt as we sat them down in the living room and explained what was happening. Sophie, our oldest, was the first to speak, her voice trembling. But why? Why can't you just fix it? We don't want you to get divorced. Jake, who had always been the quieter of the two, looked at us with wide, tear-filled eyes, his little hands gripping the edge of the couch. Doesn't this mean we won't be a family anymore? I felt my heart break all over again as I tried to find the right words to reassure them, to explain that this wasn't the end of our family, even if it felt like it. But how could I explain something that I barely understood myself? Sarah, for her part, was trying to hold it together, but I could see the cracks in her composure. She reached out to take Sophie's hand, her voice wavering as she spoke. We're still a family, sweetheart. That will never change. It's just that Mommy and Daddy can't live together anymore. But we both love you very much, and that will never change either. It was a difficult conversation, full of tears and questions that we didn't have all the answers to. We reassured them as best we could, promising that they would still see both of us, that we would both be there for them no matter what. But the sadness in their eyes, the confusion and fear, was almost too much to bear. Afterward, when the kids had gone to their rooms, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the walls that had once felt like home but now seemed like a prison. The realization of what I had lost, of what I was about to lose, hit me like a freight train. I had wanted revenge, wanted to hurt Sarah the way she'd hurt me, but now, all I felt was emptiness. Sarah joined me after a while, sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. We didn't speak, just sat in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. The anger between us had dissipated, leaving only a deep, aching sorrow that we both felt but couldn't express. Eventually, she broke the silence. I'll start looking for a lawyer tomorrow, she said quietly. We'll try to keep this as civil as possible, for the kids' sake. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The thought of involving lawyers, of turning our marriage into a legal battle, made me feel sick. But I knew it was necessary, that we had to go through the motions to make this official, to make the break clean. We'll work out the details, I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. But whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to be there for the kids. They're all that matters now. She looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness and something else, maybe regret, or perhaps just the weight of everything we were going through. I know you will, she said softly. And I want you to know that I'll always appreciate everything you've done for us, for the kids. Despite everything, you've been a good father. It was a bittersweet moment, a small acknowledgement of the love we once shared, now overshadowed by the pain of our impending separation. We both knew that this was the end of an era, the end of a chapter in our lives that we had hoped would last forever. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, discussions with lawyers, and trying to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it had to be done. The divorce process had begun, and there was no turning back. And through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything we'd been through, despite all the anger and betrayal, a part of me would always love Sarah. But that love was now buried under layers of pain and resentment, and I knew it would never be enough to bring us back together. As I packed my things to move out of the house, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. This was the beginning of a new chapter, but it was also the end of a life I had once cherished. And as much as I tried to focus on the future, on rebuilding my life, I couldn't help but mourn the loss of the family we had once been. Sarah and I said our goodbyes quietly, without fanfare or dramatics. There was nothing left to say, no more arguments to be had. We both knew that this was the only way forward, even if it wasn't the path we had imagined for ourselves. As I drove away from the house for the last time, I couldn't help but glance back at it in the rearview mirror, watching as it disappeared from view. It was the end of a chapter, the closing of a book that had once held so much promise but was now filled with regret and heartache. But life goes on, and I knew that I had to keep moving forward, for myself and for my kids. This wasn't the ending I had wanted, but it was the one I had, and I had to find a way to make peace with that. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and unknowns, but it was a road I had to walk. And as I drove into the night, I took a deep breath and braced myself for whatever was to come next. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest I've ever endured. The process of divorce, with all its legalities and emotional toll, was like ripping off a bandage that had been holding together a wound far too deep to heal quickly. Each day was a reminder of the life that had been shattered, of the family that was now split between two households. Sarah and I tried our best to keep things civil, for the kids' sake if nothing else. We exchanged polite, if strained, conversations about logistics, who would pick up the kids from school, how to divide the holidays, and the finer points of the custody arrangement. But beneath the surface, the hurt and resentment lingered, an undercurrent that neither of us could fully escape. The kids took it hard, as we knew they would. Sophie, ever the sensitive one, cried often, her little heart breaking over the loss of the family she had always known. Jake was quieter about it, but I could see the confusion and sadness in his eyes. He would sit with his toys, sometimes just staring off into space, as if trying to understand why his world had changed so suddenly. I did everything I could to be there for them, to reassure them that they were loved and that none of this was their fault. But no matter how many times I told them that mommy and daddy still loved them, I knew it wasn't the same. The stability they had once known was gone, replaced by a new reality that they hadn't asked for. Moving into my new place was a bittersweet experience. It was a small, modest apartment on the other side of town, nothing like the home Sarah and I had built together. The first night there, after the movers had left and I was alone with my boxes, the silence was deafening. I sat on the edge of my bed, surrounded by the remnants of my old life, and wondered how I was supposed to start over. I kept myself busy with the mundane tasks of unpacking, trying to turn the sterile apartment into something resembling a home. But no matter how many pictures I hung on the walls or how many personal touches I added, it never quite felt like mine. It was just a place to sleep, a place to wait until the next time I could see the kids. Visitation was the only thing that kept me going. Seeing Sophie and Jake, spending time with them, was the one bright spot in an otherwise dark and lonely existence. We went to the park, played games, and tried to make the most of our weekends together. But every time I had to drop them off at Sarah's, it felt like a piece of my heart was being torn out. Sarah and I had agreed to keep the divorce as amicable as possible, but the legal proceedings were still draining. We both had good lawyers, and we managed to avoid a full-blown courtroom battle, but there were still disagreements, still moments of tension that threatened to unravel the fragile peace we had established. The division of assets was one of the toughest parts. The house, the car, the savings, all of it had to be divided, and each decision felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. Sarah kept the house, as we had agreed, so the kids could stay in familiar surroundings. I took the car and what was left of our savings, enough to start over but not much more. One afternoon, as we were finalizing the last of the paperwork, Sarah and I sat across from each other in the lawyer's office. It was a sterile, impersonal place, all polished wood and cold professionalism. The kind of place where lives were dissected and split into neat, legalistic parts. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman who had seen more than her share of broken marriages, went over the final details, her tone brisk and efficient. But I wasn't really listening. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the years Sarah and I had spent together, the good times, the bad times, everything that had led us to this moment. When the lawyer finally finished, she handed us both the final divorce decree, the document that would officially end our marriage. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. This was it. The end of everything we had built together, reduced to a few pages of legal jargon. Sarah was the first to sign. She picked up the pen with a steady hand, her face calm, though I could see the tension in her jaw. As she scrawled her name on the line, I felt a pang of sadness, a finality that was almost unbearable. Then it was my turn. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling slightly, and hesitated for just a moment. But there was no going back now. With a deep breath, I signed my name, and just like that, our marriage was over. The lawyer nodded, satisfied, and began gathering up the documents. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, a brief moment of shared understanding, and then it was over. We stood up, and without a word, walked out of the office, side by side but worlds apart. In the hallway, we paused, neither of us sure what to say. The silence was heavy, awkward, filled with all the things we hadn't said to each other in the past few months. "Take care of yourself, Joe," Sarah finally said, her voice soft but firm. "You too," I replied, my throat tight. "And the kids, make sure they're okay." "I will," she promised, her eyes misting over. "They need you, too. Don't ever doubt that." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We stood there for a moment longer, two people who had once been everything to each other, now little more than strangers. Then, without another word, we turned and walked away in opposite directions. The weeks after the divorce were difficult, to say the least. The reality of being a divorced man, of being separated from my children, was harder than I'd ever imagined. I threw myself into work, trying to fill the void with long hours and mindless tasks, but nothing could take away the ache in my chest. My friends tried to help, inviting me out for drinks, offering words of encouragement, but none of it seemed to make a difference. They didn't understand what it was like to lose everything, to have the life you'd built crumble in your hands. They meant well, but their words rang hollow. It was during one of those long, lonely nights that I realized I couldn't keep going like this. I needed help, someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of everything I was feeling. So, I reached out to a therapist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Keller, who had been recommended by a colleague. The first few sessions were tough. I wasn't used to opening up, to talking about my feelings, especially not to a stranger. But Dr. Keller was patient, guiding me through the process, helping me to unpack the anger, the grief, the guilt that had been festering inside me. Slowly, I began to heal. The sessions with Dr. Keller helped me to understand that the divorce, painful as it was, wasn't entirely my fault. It wasn't all Sarah's fault either. We had both played a part in the breakdown of our marriage, and we both had to live with the consequences. I started to focus more on the future, on what I could do to build a new life for myself and for my kids. I got more involved in their lives, attending their school events, taking them on trips, making sure they knew that, no matter what, I was still their dad and that I still loved them with all my heart. There were still tough days, days when the loneliness was overwhelming, when the memories of what I had lost were too much to bear. But slowly, those days became less frequent, and I started to see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. As time went on, I began to rebuild. I found a new sense of purpose in my work, started reconnecting with old friends, and even began dating again, cautiously and slowly. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. Sarah and I remained civil, communicating primarily about the kids. There were no more arguments, no more harsh words. Just two people who had once been in love, now trying to navigate the difficult waters of co-parenting. And in the end, that was enough. Life would never be the same, but it didn't have to be. It was different, but it was still worth living, still worth fighting for. I had my kids, I had my health, and I had the chance to start over, to build something new. Looking back, I realized that the divorce, as painful as it had been, was a turning point. It had forced me to confront my own shortcomings, to take responsibility for my own happiness. It had taught me that life doesn't always go the way you plan, but that doesn't mean you can't find a new path, a new direction. So here I am, a divorced man, a father, and someone who has been through the worst and come out the other side. It wasn't easy, and there are still days when the past haunts me, when I wonder what might have been. But those days are fewer now, and I'm learning to let go, to focus on the future rather than the past. And as I sit here, looking out at the world, I know that there are still good things ahead. The road hasn't been easy, but I'm still walking it, still moving forward. And that, more than anything, is what gives me hope. The end of one chapter is just the beginning of another. And while I don't know exactly where this new chapter will lead, I'm ready to face it, to embrace whatever comes next. Because in the end, life is about more than just surviving. It's about living, about finding joy in the little things, about making the most of the time we have. And that's exactly what I intend to do.